to this webinar on perspective on lasting housing solution for the homeless after COVID-19. So my name is Clotilde Clark-Foulquier. I work for FIANSA, the European Federation of National Organizations working with the homeless. So this is a Housing Solutions Platform event. So Housing Solutions Platform is a cooperation between FIANSA, the organization I work for, but also the Fondation Abbé Pierre, which is a French foundation specialized in housing for the most destitute. And Sarah Koupchou is here to represent Fondation Abbé Pierre. And it's also a partnership with Housing Europe. And Natalia will present better than I can Housing Europe later on. Thank you for being all with us today. So why did the FIANSA, Housing Europe and the Fondation Abbé Pierre decide to work together on this Housing Solutions Platform? Well, it's because homelessness is not only about housing, but it's always about housing. So we decided we have to step up our effort and partnership and cooperation to find housing solutions, because we can't be speaking about how to solve our homelessness if we don't speak about housing. And so particularly in this context of COVID and health crisis, we decided to host this webinar to look a bit at what is the housing market situation now, in particular for lowest income groups, and what are the potential solutions in this very specific context to address homelessness. And so I'm very happy and honored, if I may say, to have this webinar hosted by Kim van Sparentak, who's a member of the European Parliament, but not any member, because she's the rapporteur on the Access to Decent and Affordable Housing report, which was adopted last week. Congratulations on this report, Kim, and thank you so much for taking the time to participate to our event. Can you maybe tell us more about this report, and also what is your expected impact on this report, particularly in this COVID context? Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to have been asked by FIANSA and Fondation Abbé Pierre to host this important conversation today. We are still in the middle of an acute health crisis, and it's important to not only get bogged down into the day-to-day struggles that have marked us all, politics and life of those that are struggling most and getting hit the hardest, homeless people. We should also aim to look ahead and stay focused on where we want to go and what we want to achieve. What I would like to achieve is that we end homelessness in the EU by 2030. And I've noticed I'm not alone in this. The European Parliament adopted last week my report on access to decent and affordable housing for all. And while some colleagues didn't support some progressive proposals on tackling climate change and stopping speculation, the debate, as well as an earlier resolution of the Parliament, make it clear that there's almost unanimity that homelessness needs to be solved and that the EU has a role to play. And besides setting the goal, a social moonshot strategy that rallies member states and everyone involved, the EU can do a lot more. Apologies. So first of all, some of the things that have been proposed are coordinating national homelessness strategies that focus on permanent housing solutions, taking action against countries such as Hungary that are criminalizing homelessness, and collect better data on homelessness to better know the scope of the problem. And I think the broad support is a remarkable fact in itself, because usually there's not such a big consensus when it comes to European action, specifically on social issues. I believe there's an idea that is gaining ground that the EU needs to deliver for people and that inequality and poverty are unacceptable. And when it comes to concrete action, going against the interest of big business or challenging the economic ideas and policies that are the cause of homelessness, there's still a lot of work to do. The fact that homelessness is getting the attention it has actually deserved for years is the fruit of the numbers that can't be ignored any longer. A 70% increase in the last 10 years. And also, I think we can also congratulate the relentless advocacy of organizations like FIANSA and Fondation Abbé Pierre. I believe we are also in a position where a lot can be achieved. Housing and homelessness are part of the pillar of social rights. And Commissioner Schmidt has shown the political will and personal commitment to work on the topic, and the Portuguese presidency has put it high on the agenda. The action plan for the social pillar in February, the Porto Social Summit in May, and the high-level conference on homelessness in June are the milestones that we have to work towards. The idea for a collaboration platform on homelessness is on the table, and I believe it needs two things to work. A concrete ambition, that would be the commitment to end homelessness, and input and active involvement of who's working on the ground to solve it, like all the people speaking at this event today. Looking at the solutions that were provided during the lockdowns to provide emergency shelter for the homeless, I'm left with a double feeling. Obviously, it was positive that these steps were taken and the plight of homeless people wasn't forgotten. It showed that we can provide people with housing solutions if we really want to. But too often these solutions were temporary and quick fixes. And I don't want to be cynical. I'm convinced that we can build on this to achieve lasting housing solutions for the homeless. It has opened the eyes of many that providing a roof over their head and a few square meters for themselves is a first step on the road to getting your life on the rails. And this could mean an important push for a more general adoption of a true housing first approach. And because this approach has just proven that it works. It's almost strange no one came up with the solution earlier. Provide homeless people with a home. I mean, there's of course a lot more to it than that, but what makes it strong is the idea that people will flourish not if you squeeze them out and put a lot of conditions, but when you give opportunities and show that you trust them. EU funding and exchange of practices can really help roll this approach out across Europe. Tackling homelessness can't be seen as a separate issue from assuring affordable housing, interlinked with providing affordable housing. We need more investment in social and public housing. We need to tackle speculation, and we need better protection of renters and mortgage borrowers against evictions. That's how we can prevent homelessness in the future, together with strong social security and social inclusion policies. I'm now looking very much forward to hearing your perspectives on how we can achieve this goal of ending homelessness by 2030 together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. So we will now look toward our panelists. So we will have a first panel looking at the housing market trends for the lockdown after the COVID-19. And then a second part of the meeting will be looking at what are the perspectives to address homelessness in this specific context. And then we will have the example from Martin in Lyon and Natalia from Housing Europe. But first, Willem, Cara, Chloe, and Sarah, welcome, and thank you for joining. So Willem Adema, you're a senior economist at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you work particularly in the social policy division, where you collect data from more than 40 countries on housing trends. And you monitor affordable housing policies. You recently issued a report on house prices, and we are very happy you're here, and you can tell us more about what has been recently the evolution of housing prices, particularly in the context of the COVID. Thank you. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Clotilde. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Abbé Pierre, Fondation Abbé Pierre, Fianza, and other organizers, Housing Europe, for inviting me to speak. I suspect that has a little bit to do with the report we recently released, Building for a Better Tomorrow, policies to make housing more affordable. But that is part of an ongoing stream of work in the social policy division on housing, and I have the privilege of leading that as well as work on gender and families, which are other elements on which my team focuses. I should also thank the European Union for supporting us in this important work. And I would like to share my screen. Please bear with me for a second so I can, here we go. There we are. If technology hasn't let me down, or if I have not let down technology, better to say, we should be able to see the presentation now. I hope to stick to the time, but if not, Clotilde or mevrouw van Sparentak, please wave or scream or otherwise, because I might go on otherwise, and you don't want that. Right. I think the key starting point is that despite the many differences among European countries and OECD countries, there are several housing challenges that are prevailing in most countries, in almost all countries. There is the issue of rising house prices. I'll come back to that in a minute. Much more difficult to measure are quality issues, but they are there, and they have been brought to the fore by the COVID crisis. Because in areas or in dwellings where there is overcrowding, there's a much higher chance of transmission of the virus, and the evidence coming in from various countries, including the United Kingdom and France, suggests that that has taken place. So the quality issue, which may have been snowed under a little bit in the past discussion, is back. There have been growing rates of homelessness in many countries, also prior to the COVID outbreak. And one of the interesting and important features on this has been a decline in public investment in housing since the early 2000s. So with the COVID crisis, we have new challenges, or existing challenges have come to the fore. Quality issues in housing. There was already reference to temporary housing solutions for many homeless, and now the challenge will be, of course, to find a more permanent solution, not just for homelessness, but for other structural issues in the housing market. Just a few figures and facts. Basically, across the OECD and in many countries, you're much more likely to have a housing market which is dominated by homeowners, either who own their home outright or with a mortgage. Renting is far less prevalent, but more prevalent in countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands, or Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden and Iceland. Oops, going the wrong way. What has been happening is that for rental prices, and that's the chart on the right, you can see there has been a fairly consistent increase across countries of rental price levels, which makes the affordability challenge all that much harder. The same applies for the real house price index, also accounting for the homeowners. So across the board, housing has become more expensive for families. And you can see that here as well. There you go. In terms of the trend on the right-hand side, you can see that housing as a part of spending in household budgets has increased rapidly in recent years, over the decade 2005-2015, whereas the relative share of other items in the household budget has either increased much less rapidly or declined. So health and transport costs have also increased for the household budget, but look at food. Spending on clothing and food and leisure has diminished relative in the overall household budget. And you can see that on the left-hand side, that housing almost covers more than 1/3 of the housing spending for lower income families, and it's still 1/4 for relatively well-off families. As a result, prior to COVID, so these are the 2019 data, the many low-income households across the OECD were already overburdened with the housing costs to their budget. In Chile, Israel, and New Zealand, over half of the low-income families spend more than 40% of disposable income on housing costs, and in the UK and Finland and Spain, but also the US, this percentage wasn't far behind that. And renters in the private market are much more likely to be overburdened, of course, than people in social housing. There's lots of social housing in some countries in the OECD, and then particularly the Netherlands, Denmark, and Australia, where over 20% of the stock is in the social housing sector, but much less so in countries on the right-hand side in this chart. And that's also related to the public approach towards house building, house constructing, and supporting the housing market. As I said at the very beginning of this presentation, public investment in housing development has declined since the early 2000s. And as you can see, spending on housing allowances is sort of, that's the black line in this chart, has sort of held up. But the dark blue part of the bar, the direct investment in housing development, has decreased dramatically since the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009. And of course, that is a very important feature in the housing affordability debate, and also a very important feature when it comes to thinking about future policy measures to help alleviate the housing affordability challenges. Then, pre-COVID, the homelessness rates rose in many countries. I'm not going to dwell on that. I mean, many in the audience know far more about this than I do. What is interesting and important to us is to realize that in some countries, certain groups have grown much faster. Homelessness has become more prevalent among families in Ireland, for example, among youth in Australia. So the group of homeless is becoming more diverse. We have, as part of our work, a questionnaire on affordable and social housing, and that questionnaire has been sent out just now earlier this year, and we hope to get answers back from countries by March, and by May release new numbers. And the questionnaire has questions, includes questions on homelessness. So we hope to get a better picture of what is actually going on with COVID in the coming months. With that, some words about COVID and social and affordable housing. We will get more evidence, as I said, from the questionnaire we've put to countries earlier this month. And we can already see certain trends. We are seeing that renters, tenants in the commercial market have problems. For instance, in the US, renters are much more likely than before to be behind with the payments, or they feel they're much less likely to be able to afford the next payment, and they expect that they, more so than in the past, that they have to leave their current dwelling. So all these issues, a Eurofound survey has pointed to increased housing insecurity as well. All these issues make sense in the sense that, right, prior to COVID, we had an affordability challenge. If you realize that more and more families have lost their income or are having a reduced income compared to the previous situation, it is very easy to imagine that the housing affordability challenge has increased dramatically for many families. Now, in the report we released, we tried to capture the measures that countries have taken to address the most sharp issues of the COVID pandemic in terms of housing policies. So many countries, as you can see here listed on the slide, have prohibited evictions. Other countries have taken other measures to protect tenants, either reduce or suspend rent payments or increases thereof. For homeowners, in certain countries, there have been introduced mortgage holidays and the prevention of foreclosures due to missed mortgage payments. Sometimes there have been deferments of utility payments or reform of housing subsidies, such as in France, was postponed. Then there is a lot of countries who have taken emergency support measures for the homeless, but as you will undoubtedly know, most of these measures are local, and we would not have a complete overview of all the measures that have been taken in this regard. We will continue to update this kind of information on a rolling basis, and it sort of leads to policy issues. I mean, it sort of emphasizes the importance, as I've said, of a public investment in social and affordable housing. Mevrouw van Sparrentak already referred to that. We probably have to improve targeting of our support. Tax relief, for instance, which often goes to relatively well-to-do families, should be considered. Could such public funds not be better targeted towards families who need it more? There are particular groups, youth, young people, who face challenges not just on the employment front, but also in the housing market, and there will be a demand for specific supports for them. We have to think about rental regulations. We have to find a good balance between protection of tenants, but also making sure that private landlords, private property developers actually keep investing or increase their investment in the affordable housing market. And that is the downsize potential downsize of rent controls. So we have to think about that. Everyone agrees that within the current environment, within the current crisis, there is demand, there is need for protection. But once the situation improves, and that goes far slower than I would like it to be, and I presume everyone agrees with that, we have to think about how to phase that out and how we can ensure that we protect the vulnerable, whereas at the same time give property developers the incentives to invest in accommodation. I think that's where I would leave it. Here is an overview of the work we have recently undertaken in the social and affordable housing area. The OECD has got a big housing project, which just not involves us with a focus on social work, but also my colleagues from the tax department and the environment department to focus on issues in those areas. So there's a lot of work going on housing in the OECD, and that is a major improvement on the past. Housing, we've been trying for years to get housing and social in connection with social policy work off the ground. We've only been successful with that for the last few years because there's an increasing realization that housing is an important issue for the vulnerable. And that is good news. Now we have to make that pay and make our analysis help the people at the bottom end of the housing market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William, for this very interesting overview. So basically saying that housing challenges were prevailing in most countries before the COVID, and we can see that they are logically worsening now as more and more families have lost their income. I will get back to you with question afterward, but I suggest we go straight to Cara now, and I would ask participants to please already start putting in your question in the Q&A box, or if you don't find it, even in the chat box, so we can already collect the question. Cara, so Cara Paccitti, you're working in the UK for the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank focusing on living standards for middle income groups. And you're particularly working on housing and regularly publishing a housing outlook, looking at the housing market and how it's evolving, what are the new trends. And the last one was looking at housing in recession. We've invited you to tell us more about housing market trends, particularly for people locked out of the housing market in the context of the COVID. Cara, you heard Willem. Can you see some similarities with the trends, the global trends, and what's happening in the UK in particular? Your mic is off, I think. Yes,
sorry about that.
I'll
reshare.
Do you want me to share
screen.
your presentation, or can you do it?
I think I'm fine. One second. Apologies.
Yeah, all is fine. No, that's fine. Thank you.
You'd think at this point in the pandemic I'd have it down. No, thank you very much, Clotilde, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. I think I'm going to be echoing a lot of the trends that Willem has just talked us through, specific to the UK. As Clotilde mentioned, we're a think tank that look at those on low to middle incomes in the UK. And we conducted 2 surveys of over 6,000 working age adults back in May and in September, and how they were coping with the coronavirus outbreak, but also including questions around housing. So a lot of my work I'm going to be presenting here is from those surveys and from people's observations of how things have changed during the crisis. So what I'm hoping to do is give a bit of an overview of trends in housing as well as policy responses in the UK during the pandemic, and particularly looking at our concerns going forward. So the risks of further income shocks, the government support we've seen so far and its limitations, and particularly our worries about high levels of rent arrears, particularly in the private rental sector, and how that could lead to rising evictions and homelessness in the UK. So to start, and again, this is very much jumping off from what Willem was talking about, but pre-crisis in the UK, we saw a lot of people paying increasingly high shares of their income on their housing costs, and that's particularly in the private rental sector. This chart here shows how that was rising over time from the mid-90s to 2018. And we're seeing particularly a rise in people in the private rental sectors, people who in previous generations might have been social renters, now living in the private rental sector and paying really high proportions of their income on rent. So we went into the crisis in not an ideal situation in that sense. And like many countries across Europe and across the world, we saw an economic shock of historic magnitude, and an economic shock that, because of the way the crisis hit, has particularly hit low earners, so earners in the hospitality industry, in the retail industry, and particularly people who are on low incomes pre-crisis. So this chart is showing the quarters of the labour market by income pre-crisis, and so the darkest bars are showing people who have lost jobs between February and September. The red bars show people who were still on the government support scheme, so the furlough scheme. It's our short-time work scheme where the government is paying 80% of people's wages. Those are still people who are potentially in quite a vulnerable situation in terms of the likelihood of their job existing in the future. And these light blue bars show people who have lost hours and pay due to the crisis. So around 30% of people in the bottom fifth of the labour market are seeing those changes to their incomes. How does that relate to housing? Obviously, housing is often the biggest outgoing for a lot of people, and one that's very hard to adapt to income shocks. And we've also seen that a lot of the younger and lower income people who have been worst affected by the labour market effects of the crisis are people who are already likely to be social and private renters, so who had some of the highest housing costs going into the crisis. So showing a similar chart to the previous one, so showing people in the pink who lost their jobs during the crisis up to September, or were on the government furlough scheme or lost hours and pay. And you can see as well, these dashed bars are the situation in May, and we're seeing a rising portion of people saying that they've lost their jobs by September. So we're seeing a worrying portion of people in those high cost tenure types who are seeing big hits to their income due to the crisis. As a result, and as you'd expect, that means that we've seen a lot of people reporting that they've been unable to pay their housing costs. So these pink bars are people who say they've fallen behind on part of their housing costs, and the darker red ones showing people who say they've been unable to pay all of their housing costs. So this was back in September. And again, this is really concentrated among private and social renters. We've seen far fewer people who have mortgages reporting those signs of housing stress. And particularly bleak, I think, is looking at this. So this is again the red bars, people who've fallen behind on housing costs, and the pink part of their housing costs is again, it's concentrated among people who are lowest paid pre-crisis. That's around 10% of people who are lowest paid pre-crisis saying that they are currently unable to pay fully their housing costs. And there are also further evidence of structural inequality. So again, we've looked at cut by ethnicity. And again, you see people from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background reporting far higher signs of housing stress during the pandemic. So how have people been coping, and what kind of support they had from the government? Well, there were mortgage holidays offered there's government support for homeowners in that sense. You can see here people who own the mortgage reporting that they've had a mortgage holiday being relatively high, even if those have ended by September. But support in the rental sector was largely left on an informal basis and was left for renters to negotiate on a one-to-one basis with their landlords, rent reductions or rent holidays. And we can see that actually quite a high proportion of people are reporting that they tried this and were refused, or people reporting that while they had a rent reduction, that has now ended by September. You could look at this and think that's a positive picture, that perhaps people no longer need a rent reduction. But actually other elements of our survey are suggesting people are still in quite acute housing stress. So this is people reporting how they've been dealing with their housing costs. So about over a fifth of private renters saying they've cut back on other spending to pay housing. Another large portion of people saying they've been using savings or borrowing money. And that's particularly worrying in a crisis that's coming up to a year's time. Like, these are temporary, informal ways people are able to cover housing costs. They're not ways that are going to be sustainable over a longer term for people to actually cover their housing costs going forward. I think, like Willem said, it's also in the UK really brought housing quality into focus this crisis, as we've had stay-at-home measures like everyone else in the world. This is a particularly depressing chart, I think, looking at just as children, the proportion of children living in households exhibiting these factors of kind of low housing quality, so damp in the house or overcrowding, and again showing that those from lower incomes, so these circular dots, are far more likely to be experiencing those. And we've also seen that's had a significant impact on people's well-being. So this pink dot is pre-coronavirus, and you're seeing big rises in people reporting issues relating to their well-being, just controlling for all other factors just relating to tenure. So we think that is having a material impact on how people have been able to deal with the crisis. So looking ahead, I think it's a particularly bleak picture for renters and people on low incomes. And our real worry is people having been unable to cover housing costs and building up really significant arrears. And the picture is particularly worrying because in terms of the income shock, at least in the UK, we think the worst is yet to come. Both of our sort of official forecasters, the Bank of England, the Office for Budget Responsibility, are projecting unemployment to peak in the middle of next year once the government's furlough and job support scheme ends. And for that, after that, a lot of people will then flow onto universal credit, which is our main kind of benefit system. That was increased in generosity back in March when the crisis hit. That increase is likely, or is currently supposed to end this March, which would be a £20 a week reduction in claimants' incomes, or around £1,000 a year reduction in the incomes around 6 million families. So we're seeing likely labour market kind of income shocks, as well as some potential policy income shocks. And that's very much still a live debate at the moment. So there is hope that there might be a reversal of that policy decision. Talking further about the benefit system, and particularly housing benefit, we've seen a big increase in claimants, people who are claiming housing benefit for the first time, particularly among private renters. We might expect social renters to already have been claiming housing benefit, but around a third increase in private renters claiming that benefit. That was also increased in generosity, but up to the 30th percentile of rents in the area. So you can claim up to that 30th percentile of rent. But if you're somebody who pre-crisis decisions you made about your housing, you chose to live in a property that was more like the typical rent or more like the median, for a lot of areas in the UK, you're going to have to be finding on top of the benefit another, say, £100 or even several £100s in more expensive areas like London from your already depleted income. So that's one thing we're particularly worried about, is that there's been welcome increases to housing benefit, but there's still gaps and there are still people having to find that extra cash. And all of this builds the picture of a lot of people who are going to be in housing that they cannot afford. They're going to be unable to continue living in for cost reasons. And we asked people where they thought they'd be living in 12 months' time, and around 6% of private renters said that they would either have to leave out of choice because they could no longer afford their property, or would be asked to leave or sell. So that's really where our worry is coming from in terms of evictions, and also in terms of the supply of more affordable housing for this large chunk of people that are going to have to have a readjustment in their housing costs. So overall, the conclusions is it's quite a bleak picture, and a lot of the kind of government support and also informal coping strategies like paying housing costs out of your savings are going to be wearing thin at this point. There's some worries around gaps in the benefit system and even policy choices that are likely to deplete that support of people's incomes. And actually on the housing side, we're going to need to see action in terms of dealing with significant rent arrears that people have probably built up during the crisis, and avoid a wave of evictions into the middle of next year. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you very much, Cara, for this precise data on the UK situation. Quite a bleak picture, but that underline really strongly again what William said in terms of the need for public support to go through this housing crisis. I would like to ask participants to send over some questions, and I will I'll turn to the last panelist on this panel. So Chloe and Sarah. Chloe Serre-Morin, so you work at FIANSA, and Sarah at the Fondation Abbé Pierre. You work together every year on an overview of housing exclusion in Europe. So the last one is the fifth one from 2020, and it was published mid-April. So already the virus had struck Europe, and we could start to see the consequences of the health situation. So you will both tell us more about this housing exclusion picture and the impact of the health crisis, particularly for homeless people. And then we will happily turn toward Martin and Natalia for positive solution to address this difficult context. Thank you, Chloe and Sarah.
Thank you, Clotilde. I'm just also sharing my screen now. Okay. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the former presentations that were really enlightening on the OECD global picture and the UK picture. I think first of all, it's quite interesting to see that the pandemic impacted the way we see housing and the concept of home. Basically, I think now we collectively understand that adequate, affordable, stable housing is basically vital to healthcare. And it definitely helped in putting the fight for the right to housing for all higher on political agendas at local and national and European levels. And again, thank you, Kim, for the report and for all the work that is now undergoing at European level. I think it's quite, it's late. It's always too late because the situation is terrible, but of course it's now or never. And I think it's great that we have all these different energies around the table to act together on the fight against homelessness. I wanted to set the scene of the context before the pandemic, but I think we already had a huge amount of information from Willem and from Cara. So maybe just a broad overview of the housing exclusion statistics of Eurostat, so in Europe. So here you have numbers and proportion of people who are overburdened by housing costs. So we have 10% of the European population being overburdened by housing costs. It's data from 2018, so before the pandemic. We had also 15% of people living in overcrowded conditions, 4% of European population living in severe housing deprivation, 3% in arrears, on rent or mortgage arrears, and etc. People also 13% of European population living in damp conditions. But I will not go deeper there because we had already the picture previously. But what is interesting to highlight is the fact that we still don't know how many people are homeless in Europe. And this is a problem if we want to have a proper objective at European level, of course. We have a view of different alarming data in different European countries, but it's different methodologies, different definitions that are existing in different European countries. But we tried to have an estimate, and that's what Kim already told us about the 70% increase in 10 years. It's based on estimates, so it's really an idea of what is happening, but we could say that now and with the crisis, we have a further increase in acute homelessness, basically, so people sleeping rough or in emergency or temporary accommodation. And maybe also important to say that all the different evidences that we have in European countries, here you have all the different increases in different countries, in France, in Denmark, in Ireland, etc. And the only European country where homelessness as a global issue has been decreasing in the past 10 years is Finland. And I think most of you around the table today know a bit about Finland and the way Finland has been implementing long-term strategies to end homelessness based on housing first principles, etc. But I will not go deeper here. Sarah will be on the solutions part afterwards. So this is the broad picture pre-crisis, let's say. Now, with the pandemic and the COVID situation, we have, of course, this inherent risk related to housing deprivation and homelessness when it comes to infection risks. And the fact that, of course, how do you lock down or how do you confine yourself without a home to be protected in? So we have this issue, this huge issue of people being very vulnerable when they are in a homelessness situation due to the fact that they live in collective accommodation, in promiscuity, in overcrowding, etc. And we also have a second challenge here. It's the fact that economic consequences hit hardest people in risk of poverty or exclusion and in a precarious employment. And that's what Cara also showed us. I just was amazed by the fact that 6% of private renters expect to leave their homes because of cost pressure in the coming year. In the UK, it's huge. It's 6% of private renters. And I think this is something we still don't see in homelessness data because it's a bit early to see the proper effects of those trends. But definitely, it's something that is coming, and we have to think how to help all those people who will be out of housing markets in the close future. And maybe also, if we don't have homelessness data showing the effects of the pandemic now, we still start to have data on sharp increases in users of basic needs services. For instance, we have in France, Secours Populaire, which is the food assistance association, and they did a survey where they registered an increase of 50% of people using food assistance between March and August 2020. And we also have, and it concerns more than 1 million people, basically. And we also have data from Italy, from Caritas, where their services registered an increase of more than 100% of people asking for material support, so food assistance, also evictions, counseling, etc. So it's basically showing that we will face huge challenges ahead. Maybe on the strategies and the emergency measures that have been implemented during the crisis and for almost 1 year now, the crisis showed us that basically it's possible to end rough sleeping in European countries and to respect the fundamental right to shelter in the short term. In the short term, I'm basically in the UK, for instance, the Everyone In scheme. So it's a scheme that has been implemented in the first wave of the pandemic in March 2020. And this scheme was aiming to give accommodation to all rough sleepers in a very short term, like in an emergency response to the fact that people were rough sleeping. And it basically accommodated 33,000 people in March 2020. So I think it's quite striking to see that it was possible at that time to just find accommodation for everybody. And it's possible to develop and adopt ambitious protective policies for vulnerable people. As we saw with Willem, we had rent freezes in Europe, we had suspension of evictions. So when the will is here, we can protect people from the worst aspects of the crisis. The problem is that we systematically face the lack of long-term vision and the inadequacy of funding and policy. And now we are still in this eternal focus on emergency shelter, and we can't really find a space for dignified, lasting housing solutions. And we saw that in lots of European countries, in France too, in Belgium, services and local authorities found very like lots of energies to find hotels, tourist accommodation, and Airbnb to house homeless people. And this was really positive to find this this common will. But now we have this huge challenge of emergency accommodation systems that were already saturated before the crisis and that will face higher pressure with the current pandemic. So now I will leave the floor to my colleague Sarah to be on the bright side of things and to open to possible solutions on that side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe. Well, I will try to adapt my presentation with everything told already by other speakers, because I think we said a lot of things. But well, I think that the COVID crisis shows us that we have a lot of creativity for finding some solutions during the crisis to put people inside. And we saw that in different countries we used, I put some example on my slide, but I'll let you see it. But I think that for years we tried to manage the housing crisis with the needs of people to have some solutions. And we find a lot of tools, I can say, like to transform some hotels into housing, to use vacant private housing, to develop some rent intermediation, like we do it in France, for example, to use the private markets as a social solution. But in fact, the problem is more structural, and we have to find all over these tools. We have to find some real policy solutions, and what we have recommended in our report since 5 years now is to investigate because, well, what we see is some ideas from policy. Chloé, est-ce que tu peux revenir à la présentation? As we see, the problem is since years we have a decreasing of the expenditure of housing in housing construction from member states, and we have to find the solution to change this tendency, to change the investment of member states in housing policies and in strategy that are integrated. And that's why we think that the solution is not really in tools that to find some way to manage the crisis with the needs is to rethink and to do the shift, as said Leila Nifara about the housing market, to do the shift and to change our regard on our view on housing issues. And I think we have to work all together to think, and Kim said that in his report, the protection of the renters, the prevention of homelessness, with the regard on eviction, the regard on people who are getting out of institution, prison, hospital, child care, and so on. And this is really a big strategy that will change the housing crisis and the question of homelessness. And we will eradicate the homelessness only if we accept to change our view of this policy. So can you change the slide, please, Chloe? So, well, what is an integrated strategy to fight homelessness? Is housing first. As we said in French, it is in the old pot that we are doing the best sauce. So I think that the solution is known now and for years, because in Finland they work since 20 years to fight homelessness, and they find the solution, and the solution is housing first. So first of all, we have to use the housing at the beginning of the solution in each policy, and we have to get out the silos policies. We have to think housing first for young people. We have to think housing first for families who are in difficulties, in rent difficulties. We have to think of housing first for childcare, and this is the first solution, and to put users and their rights at the centers of this strategy. Why? Because, as said Chloe and also Kim, we have to know who are homeless people. For the moment, we don't know that. We have some indicators that said that homeless people, the profile is changing. We have more young people, we have more families, but in fact, we don't really know in which proportion and what are the needs of those people. And we have to think about that first. And for this, we need data, and we need to have the response corresponding of the needs on the ground. And to think that home is a right. It's not just an instrument of financial instrument. We have to funding and give the adequate resources to reach the goal. And for this, of course, we need the EU to put a big will to use funds to put an end to homelessness, and with the negotiation of the use of cohesion funds, I think it's important for all stakeholders to use a part of the EU fund to put an end to homelessness, and to switch and to do the transition from the old model to housing first model. And in some region in France, for example, we saw that the next programmation it's not focus is not focused on the homeless fight, and we can change that. We have to change that. We have few months for that now, and I think it's a big challenge. But it is not only the EU funding; it is also the state funding, also the local funding. Cities have to invest in the housing crisis. The strategy have to be continuing and constant, because we cannot always change our mind. And we saw in Finland that even with the policy change, the government change, but the goal is still the same. And we need some years to put an end to homelessness. So we need all stakeholders, political stakeholders, to be okay on this goal, and to continue the strategy, even if we have change of policy side. Sorry for my English. I know that it's not really easy to do to follow, but I think it's enough clear. And at the end, I want to say that we need a multi-level governance. Why? Because we saw it with the COVID crisis. When everybody works all together, we can do things. And we have the proof in England, we have the proof in France, we have the proof in Belgium, when all the level of decision are working all together, when SEO, CSO, when with the organization, with the local government, with the national government, we can find some solutions. So we have to work all together, even if we are not agree in all points, but to find some solutions, it's important to involve everybody. Well, I think this is just a little word on what we developed more in our report in 2018, and you can find everything in. But there is an emergency. I think everybody is okay on this, and even if during the COVID crisis, and we saw almost all homeless people get in and have some roof to protect them. We saw that in the street we have still people dying in France and in other countries in Europe, like in Germany, for example. So it's a big emergency for everybody to move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Chloe. So we have some questions. So first, if participants want to add question, please in the Q&A and chat now, or even maybe take the floor. You can raise your hand, click on the button, raise your hand, and I will give you the floor. I don't know, Mauro had a question. Efa, do you want to present the question, or shall I give the floor to Mauro as you want?
You can give the floor to Meryl, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just need to find him. Yeah. Mauro, do you want to maybe directly present your question? Yeah, thank you.
No, I was curious to know whether you have data about countries or cities that actually managed to end rough sleeping during the pandemic. Because we talk a lot about the end of rough sleeping during the pandemic, but as far as Brussels is concerned, actually the number of rough sleepers more or less stayed the same. It's also because like many services had to limit their capacity. So of course we had like additional places like hotels and other emergency structures, but in reality the number of places available didn't change that much in relation to our winter program, let's say. And the second question I had, but maybe it's too many. But anyways, the second is really like, I understand the housing first is important, but I mean, housing first is supposed to be for profiles which are very complicated, like people with who are in the street for a long time, who have mental health problems, drug addiction, or alcohol consumption, misuse, and things like that. So, I mean, are we, like you, Sarah, you mentioned housing first for families. Is that the right solution? I mean, housing first is not supposed to be for families. I mean, there are other models which are lighter than housing first that are also less expensive if you want. So sometimes it's just a question of finding housing for families. For instance, you don't need to have like housing first support. But anyway, that's like, maybe it's more like a complicated question to reply now. But I'm very interested to know if you have examples of cities or countries that actually managed to end rough sleeping during the pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you. Before you respond to Mauro, I have a few questions myself. Something that came back from several of your presentation is the need for public investment. So I have a direct question to Willem. Do you have data showing what are the countries that invest the most in housing proportionally to their gross national product? And is there evidence of the positive impact on the affordable housing for those countries? And then maybe a question to Cara, because Willem also said it's not only about public investment, but also about incentive for property developers as well to invest. Do you have data on this situation in the UK? Are there incentives for private developer to develop affordable housing? Is this working, or how could this be improved? Are there housing solutions for people who are locked out, a bit like what Sarah presented? And a question to Kim. So we see the very bleak picture, not only if we look at the 5 years before us, but if we look forward, we see Also, there seems to be a political context quite positive to now address the situation. But do you believe we will really manage to basically invest actively and almost, I would say, aggressively into housing solutions? And if not, what are the barriers? And maybe for other speakers, if you want to jump in, what are the barriers to invest in social housing, in development to housing first, when we see the social need being so strong and the crisis being so strong for years now? Why isn't there a political cross-party decision, a bit like what happened in Finland, to now address the situation? So those were my questions. There are more questions as well. Maybe we can go around and you can respond to what you want. Maybe we start with Cara. Oh sorry. Okay, Sarah, then go on.
I just wanted to respond to Mauro about the question of housing first. I think it's a Mauro. I'm sorry. I think your question is an expert's debate. In fact, what we want to say about housing first is that housing should have to be the first step, and after that, I think that we can speak about housing first for the most people with the most vulnerable people with a lot of needs. But the idea is we can speak about housing led if you want, but I think it's still a question of experts. And at the end, we have to say on this message that the housing need to be the first step, and we have to give with the housing the adequate support. And if the person or the family doesn't need this support, well, okay, this is housing first because we give the housing first. And it doesn't mean that we cannot think between us on the ground how we will manage this difference of the need of just housing or a housing with a big support or a housing with a little support, and we can speak about that. But the question is, if we want a policy, a changing policy as a new strategy, we have to stay on this word housing first. Housing is the first response of people for people in need. That's what I meant. I don't know how to say that.
Thank you. And there is more on housing first from Samara in the chat box, if you're interested. Cara?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on your question about housing supply and the building of housing, and particularly affordable housing in the UK, I think you're right in saying that's going to be a really important factor in terms of kind of solutions to this. And in some respects, public investment-wise, we've seen sort of decades of underinvestment in the UK. But the picture in terms of current investment is looking a bit more positive. Got, I think, £11.5 billion committed to affordable housing over the next 5 years. What I think is worth focusing on is how we define affordable housing, though, because a lot of that is for affordable housing not necessarily defined as social housing as we might traditionally think of it, as the most kind of cheap and secure tenure type. Affordable housing, that's now just 15% of the affordable housing that's been built in most recent years in the UK. It used to be about 85%. And the rest of kind of that affordable housing that's been built are things like shared ownership or affordable rent, but that's kind of a higher bar of rent. And for some families, those might be good tenure types, but for some of the most vulnerable and lowest income groups, they're still likely to social housing is still likely to be the best solution for them. So I think that's a worry, is we might still see public investment in affordable housing, but what affordable housing are we talking about? I think that's a really important question.
Thank you very much. Willem?
Yeah, thank you very much. The question on overall government spending on housing. Do we have some numbers? We have some numbers, but I emphasize the word some. We have a pretty good picture of what countries spend on housing allowances. It already gets more complicated when it comes to what countries spend on housing services. A lot of these services are provided by local governments. So there is a serious risk of double counting if you measure the central government transfer to local government and then the de facto spending on housing services. And then across countries, there's huge difference in tax spending. So we have some numbers on mortgage relief and support for in that area for homeowners. And in Finland, I think it's almost up to 1% of GDP. But we have such numbers for a limited amount of countries, about 8 or 10, that you can find them in affordable housing database. The only thing we can do in this regard is actually publish those numbers and then hope that in future more countries will respond to the relevant questions in the questionnaire as we put out. But that's, if you want to have, that's the challenge. We don't have a comprehensive picture across OECD countries on what each country spends on housing. I spent some time looking for the raise my hand button because I had a question for Cara. In your presentation, you mentioned that private renters need to borrow some money, and you ended up with saying that a lot of people need to find extra cash. My question for you is, do you have any information as to where they find this extra money? I mean, if this, banks may not lend to low-income people because they find them not credit worthy. Are we talking about loan sharks who give money to very poor people? Because then the problem is even bigger than it already is. That's just a ticking time bomb. Or are we talking about family transfers, which might not be such an immediate concern? Do you have any information on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's also something that not just specific to housing we've been looking at is people towards the lower income bracket in the UK borrowing more over the crisis and also being more likely to be using expensive forms of credit, things like credit cards, or rather than say borrowing from friends and family, but that is also part of the picture, is people borrowing from kind of family and friends. So yeah, I think we're also, our next wave of the survey that we're doing is currently in the field at the moment, and we're hoping then to get a better picture of how much the kind of rent arrears we're talking about, but also a better, clearer picture of borrowing and kind of household balance sheets. But it is worrying, obviously, in terms of people's credit going forward as well. That's going to be a long-lasting effect of the crisis, is if people then can't borrow in future because they have this kind of black mark against their name. But no, it's a really important point.
Thank you very much. We're starting to have questions now, but we will soon need to move on to the second panel. But Kim, of course, if you want to respond, please.
Yes, about the question of, seeing that we have a political momentum, but not having seen the right action so far from the European level. I think we are really at a moment where we can change things. So first of all, of course, the political leverage seems to be there. It's well taken by almost all political groups, that we have to really take action to make sure that most vulnerable groups in our society are supported rather than being let down by the European Union. And I also think this is really a moment to continue making noise as organizations also working in member states. The recovery fund is coming, and this will be, there's a lot of money coming from the European Union. And I really hope that we can make sure that this recovery will be also a social recovery. So of course a green recovery, but also a social recovery, to make sure that we invest in housing, we invest in affordable housing, and we invest in housing solutions. And I know that a lot of the programs are being decided on right now in member states. So this is also really the moment to go to your national MPs and make sure that they are aware that the recovery fund can be used for these kind of solutions.
Thank you very much, Kim. We have a question on best practice, and it's a perfect transition, I think, to move on to the second panel. We will have more opportunities for questions after that. So our second panel is looking at perspective to address homelessness in the COVID-19 context. And we will start with Martine Chanal, who works for the Metropole of Lyon on housing particularly, and who will present to us the Zero Return to the Street program. And we can see there how COVID is an opportunity to address homelessness. Maybe we have this crisis, but you will tell us more than I can about what Lyon has done. Thank you very much, Martine. I'll put your presentation on the screen.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for the invitation. I hope I will try to be clear. First, I'm going to start by explaining a bit of the local context of the Métropole de Lyon, because it's a specific organization. So, Clotilde, if you want to go ahead. After. The Metropole was created in 2015 with the merger of two local authorities, and now it has a broad range of competencies. So the Metropole has almost all the competencies to tackle the issues of homelessness, like economic integration and minimum income.
Pardon, est-ce que tu peux parler un tout petit peu plus proche du micro? Voilà, super. Merci.
Okay. Economic integration and minimum income, housing and of course social housing, and urban planning, solidarity. So we have a broad range of competencies, and it's very important for us. Next, please. The Metropole is composed by 59 cities, which represents approximately 1.4 million people. We have 24% social housing, so it's a high level, and around 70,000 ongoing requests, and only 9,000 are provided each year. And this number is decreasing. Decreasing, and even though we built a lot of social housing with 5,000 units each year. And like Sarah and Chloe said before, in France we don't really know how many homeless there are. So we try to better know the reality in the Metropole. At the end of 2019, we estimate there were at least 18,000, 2,500 row sleeper, people who called 115 in the last 2 weeks of December, and almost 16,000 homelessness, 6,000 people in shelter or accommodation, and more than 9,000 applying for shelter. So now I'm going to focus on how we implement the housing first strategy in the Métropole de Lyon. First, since 2018, the Metropole has the lead to implement housing first at the local level. We built this implementation upon 3 pillars, which are of course, the offer. The goal is to increase the supply of affordable flats. Also, we are giving grants for NGOs to implement innovative models of social support and access to housing. And for the third, we wish to change management strategies and professional practices to improve the implementation of housing first principle. So you have on the screen the goals to reach within 5 years. Well, I'm not sure that we can reach it, but we have targets, so it's important. And to reach these goals, you can pass, please. We need to write the story together. We organize permanent activities to mobilize every stakeholders and progress together on the implementation of Housing First. So it's very important. Currently, we are working with NGOs to design their own transformation strategy with the new report of the Cour des Comptes. We also need financial innovation to make the shift for scaling up the Housing First model. We work with European banks to find new funds. And in the same time, we have launched trainings, evaluation, and exchange of good practice. You know that, for example, we have created a specific degree for Housing First. So we have a big commitment in this policy. But with the COVID, we have to change our goals. So you can pass, please. I would explain how the COVID has been an opportunity for us to fight homelessness. Because during the first lockdown in March 2020, the state, the metropole, and the NGOs have been very involved to find solutions for homeless people. 2,000 homeless people have been provided with temporary housing in hotel or in temporary solution. 2 special medical centers for homeless people who have COVID but who don't require hospitalization have been created. So we have a lot of a big invest of all the partners. And before the end of the lockdown and the state of emergency, the question for all the partners in July was what should we do with these people in temporary accommodation? We can't go back. We have to change our way of doing, especially with the threat of a second wave of COVID-19 and now a third wave. So the state, the metropole, the NGO, and the social housing company were agreed to launch the plan Zero Return to the Streets. To reach this goal, we had started to work with social housing companies. We already have an intercommunal agreement with them, but 6% of allocation must be for households who live in shelters or for roof sleepers. This represents around 500 housing units each year. The goal at this time was for the provider was to prioritize allocations, no increase, but prioritize before the end of October 2020. It was a really success. During this period, almost 400 housing social units have been effectively allocated, 80 per month against 20 in the first period. So it was a real effort for the providers. But we saw that only few people sheltered during the crisis were able to access to social housing. Migrants, people with no income and without rights to housing cannot reach it. And also the beneficiaries were already people in shelters, so this shows us that we had a lot of people in shelter who shouldn't be there because they have a right to housing, so it's strange. We have something to change. So it was the first pillar. After you can. So at the same time, in June, a new team has been elected with a new policy project with more commitment on this issue in Metropole. They want to reinforce our action in Housing First and apply the principles of welcoming territories. So we have worked to increase temporary urbanism solutions for those who cannot access to social housing. For that, we need to identify all opportunities of vacant land management managed by the metropole and involve all relevant stakeholders in this policy. We reach a part of our goal. The metropole has identified and already developed 35 housing units from the providers, 4 sites to install tiny village, 2 squats where we can have an agreement with the inhabitants. So we try to develop new action for temporary solution. And finally, I don't speak. You don't have that on the screen, but finally, we create an emergency fund for helping tenants who have difficulties for paying their rents. The budget is around 1.3 million, and it starts in July 2020. Currently, 1,000 files have been received. So we can see the importance of the crisis for people for people. Yes, I finish. I think no, I have something more to finish. This plan also has long-term targets. First, we wish to speed up the current work, such as research for funding from European banks to buy dwellings from the private housing stock, because the gap in the level of the rent for private stock and social housing is very big. So it's a very big difficulties for us. And now we are working with the Economic and Touristic Division of Métropole de Lyon to identify opportunity to buy some hotels. Indeed, some of them have big difficulties with the crisis, so we are looking to transform them in social housing. And second, the support to households should be adjusted according to the needs and housing first principles. But we need to find a new organization without silo. Currently, each partner mobilizes his own budget, so we must mutualize our resources to boost the plan. So I finished this time. It's true.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you. I will ask again participants to prepare questions, please, and also to other panelists if you have questions to Martin. Thank you very much for showing the mobilization of the city, the metropole of Lyon. We were speaking about political awareness and reaction, taking the COVID also as an opportunity to provide solutions. So that's a very good example we want to highlight. I will get back to you with questions afterwards. But first, I wanted also to turn toward Natalia Rokazewska, who is the chair of the Housing Europe Social Affairs Working Committee. We wanted to ask you about social housing. We spoke a lot about social housing. How can social housing providers today, particularly in the context of COVID, respond to increasing needs? Thank you very much for being with us, and I will again share my screen and show your presentation. If I can find it.
Thank you, Clotilde, and thank you for inviting me today. I can maybe just start in saying that I'm wearing 2 hats today. I'm representing both Housing Europe as a chair of the Social Affairs Committee, as Clotilde already said, and Housing Europe is the European Federation, you know, for social and public and cooperative housing. But I'm also wearing a hat of BL, Danmarks Almene Boliger, which is the National Federation of Non-Profit Housing Organizations in Denmark. So in Europe, we have around 26 million homes represented in Housing Europe, and in Denmark, it's around 500,000 homes and 1 million people living in social housing. Of course, as housing providers, we are key in order to eliminate housing homelessness, which has already been said. And also, Clotilde, you said in the beginning that it's not only about housing, but it's always about housing. So I'm very happy to be here today because it's really an important issue that we're talking about. And also just to make clear that, because before there was this slide showing, I think it was Willem, showing that in Denmark we have quite a high amount of social housing, which is true. But just to give you a bit of input, in Denmark, social housing is not just for the most vulnerable people. It is an alternative housing option on the housing market that is non-profit, and you enter through a waiting list. So everyone can apply. But of course, our main purpose is to ensure good quality housing for everyone in need. So even though we have a universal model, so to say, in reality, we of course do house people who struggle to find housing on their own, whether it's due to economic or social issues. And the whole idea is to have this mix of people, because we know that people who struggle in life have better opportunities when they live together with people who are more resourceful. And so slide 3, Clotilde, please. Yes. So just to give you a European overview when talking about housing, the picture is broad and diverse. I'm sure you also know this, also among Housing Europe members. And of course, it means that the local solutions are also different. But what is important to discuss today is what Europe can do on a European level. So next slide, please. And when thinking about what I had to say today, so much has already been said, and I would like to bring something new to the table. But the thing is that we as social housing providers know what is needed. We are dealing with a lot of these issues, and we have been dealing with many of these issues for many years. So apart from the fact that we provide the home, we as social housing organizations, we have the same goal as the organizations who wish to end homelessness. We want to make social investments, so to say, the new agenda. I think it was already back in 2013 that the European Commission launched its social investment package, and maybe now finally we are at the right timing. So social housing providers are and have been at the forefront for housing first approaches to homelessness. We know what works, we know what is needed, and now it's really important that the European Union deliver the frame, but also the political push for member states to deliver nationally and locally. So I really believe, as has already been said, and what you also said, Kim, that 2021 is the moment. I think the pandemic has made homelessness much more relevant, not only looking at a vulnerable or a certain group of people, but it's relevant for basically all of us, because more people have become homeless, and we see the demographic of the homelessness group is changing. And this is also what Willem said before. So I think this is really a wake-up call for many citizens as well as political systems. So next slide, please. This is just a slide that I think, Willem, you already had this in one of your presentations, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but obviously linked to who is the group or the target group that we're talking about. When more and more people are having difficulties paying for their homes, either they are, being evicted and becoming homeless, or they have to move and live in houses that are not adequate for them. And this again has other social consequences. So just next slide. So homelessness is one of the areas where social housing providers deliver solutions that decreases social inequality and increases welfare. So in the beginning of my presentation, what I said is that social housing organizations work and organization to end homelessness, we have the same goal, which is to make social investments really a political agenda. And I think what COVID has shown us is that we globally need this new competitiveness, and it's not impossible. Before there was a question to Kim whether you think it will be possible now. I think what COVID has shown us is that it is not impossible, because there is a lot of potential if you have the political will. So investing in the right areas will create better societies, better lives, and better economies. And that will create more wealth for all. And this new competitiveness is basically the potential that I see ending homelessness can bring us towards. So we can use homelessness as a platform to kickstart this new competitiveness. And I also think that in crisis time, the most important ability is to keep and maintain a long-term focus. And this is also what looking into homelessness can help us do, is to really have these long-term social investment glasses on. So next slide, please. So obviously the best way to fight homelessness or to prevent homelessness is to prevent people from becoming homeless. And this is why social and affordable housing companies offer housing first and housing to people who would otherwise be excluded from the private market. So social housing providers carry out support programs for the homeless towards permanent housing, and this is now called housing first. And I very much agree with some of the discussions that were before. So obviously it is a very expert-led discussion on how to use housing first, but I think housing first is more and more, at least what I see also in Denmark, becoming a way of, a systemic way of thinking. So saying, okay, we need to provide the homes, and then we can discuss on how to create an environment around the people within the homes based on their needs, that actually makes them stay there and makes them succeed better in life. So next slide, please. The Odense model that some of you might have heard about. We use housing first, and eliminating homelessness is actually key of the city strategy, and their overall goal is to be an inclusive city. And they have three kind of overarching goals. So they want to be a city where there's room for all. They want to be a city where everyone feels safe, and also they want to be a city where everyone takes a common responsibility for being inclusive. So the needs of vulnerable people are really a part of the urban planning and the urban development, equally with other considerations. And this also means specifically that the Employment and Social Affairs Administration of the municipality is always included as in part of the planning of the city and of the urban development and urban renewal projects. And this simple idea of really being cross-sectoral has been one of the main elements in driving Housing First in Odense as a big success. And this is now really spreading into other municipalities in Denmark. And what we also have is that we have a homelessness guarantee. So the authorities, local authorities, are actually guaranteeing, together with the housing organizations, that if you are homeless, you have to be able to have a place to stay. So next slide, please. So in Odense, homelessness has been reduced by 40% during the last 10 years, and nearly 500 citizens have obtained their own housing. And 87 of them have kept their places. And what studies really show is that is the close cooperation between social housing organization and the municipality that is very essential in the positive change that has been in Odense. And one of the common goals that the housing organization and the municipalities have together. So the housing organizations, social housing organizations, are actually also an integral part of the city strategy, is that they want to ensure that there are affordable housing in Odense. They are working together with the social housing organizations in finding the adequate housing. So the available housing that is available both in, you could say, quality, but also in price. And that the people who are moving into these homes have to have access to social support. And this is support that is happening as they move in, during their after they moved in, and it is a running cooperation. So in that way, it also becomes very flexible. So we have social housing workers who are on the spot in the housing area every day, and they are really building a bridge into, you could say, the municipal system. So they make sure that there is a flexible social support whenever the person needed and in the level that the person needed. And they can also make different agreements with the tenant. So for example, if the person has difficulties paying their rent, in order to prevent eviction, the housing organization can administer the rent payment. So when social services deliver the economic support, the check, then there is a cooperation between the social services and the housing, social housing organization, that the rent is always paid first. Of course, this is on a voluntary basis agreed with the tenant. So next slide, please. I just want to lift it up a little bit. So saying from the local level and the Odense model, we also have an ongoing dialogue now with the government, because in 21 we will have a national strategy in Denmark on homelessness. And this strategy basically walks on 3 legs, or has 3 tracks. So there is a national track, and there is a local track, and then there is the preventive track. And obviously the national track is very important for us as social housing providers, as this is all about making sure that there is available housing. So both in numbers and in rent. So we can deliver, and we want to deliver these houses, or these homes for the most vulnerable people. So social follow-up has to be effective and locally anchored and cross-sectoral. So this is basically taking the Odense model from a local level and lifting it up nationally. But obviously we want to also further implement the experiences that we have from Odense locally. So really have this close cooperation, both formally and informally, between social housing organizations and municipality, but also have follow-up meetings that are more or less formal. So in some areas they need to be formal, so that we have a clear division of responsibilities and some clear common strategic goals that we are working towards. Because what has been at least one of the experiences in Denmark is that because this goes across sectors, it's also responsibility easily gets lost between chairs, so to say. So to have some written agreements that you meet around each year to have a follow-up. Did everyone deliver? Did it work? Do we need to change something? So having a more agile system locally. And then of course the preventive track, which I also talked a little bit about already. We need different tenant initiatives, like financial and budget advice. So do you know what it means to actually administer your economic situation? If not, you need help to do that. Can we help in any ways? And also, are there any social services, or are there any financial aids that you are actually that you can have, but that you are not getting? Because we also see that with a lot of our more vulnerable tenants, is that they are actually financial aid that they are eligible to get, but that they just don't know about, or they don't know how to apply for it. So we're also helping them with that. So next slide, please. So we already talked about this, that 2021 can really be this watershed moment for battling homelessness in Europe. So not only can this be a very important moment in time, we actually have some good platforms to act on and through. First of all, the resolution. Again, congratulations on this, Kim. I know you didn't do it alone, but still thank you so much for the relentless effort, not only on homelessness, but also on affordable housing agenda. It's very important for us. We also have the action plan on the European pillar of social right. We all know Principle 19 saying that we need access to social housing of good quality for those who are in need. We also need the right to appropriate assistance for the vulnerable people and to protect them against forced eviction. And we also have to have adequate shelter and services for the homeless. And in Housing Europe, we've made a position paper on the action plan, and I'm sure Julian can share that later on in the chat. But here, I just want to stress one of the main points, and that is that the action plan really needs, as we see it in Housing Europe, to anchor a do no social harm principle in all European policies, so including the European semester and the country-specific recommendations. We have to make sure that European policies do not undermine the abilities or the creativity or the needs of member states to support social housing providers in fulfilling their mission. So this is very important, the do no social harm principle. And as many already said today, the constant decrease of public funding for housing policies over the last decade has been one of the key determinants of the affordable housing crisis that we face right now. And here it is important to continue to make use of the investment clause within the Stability and Growth Pact in order to increase public investment efficiently in housing policies. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we have the political momentum that we have already talked about, because people see, because of the COVID crisis, that what is happening right now is not continuable. It is relevant for more and more people, and people are losing their jobs and are losing their homes, and this has nothing to do with basically whether you are in a vulnerable position or not. It is a crisis, and that hits all of us. So I think this is a very important element. So next slide, please. So just my final remarks on top of that is that it has become clear that integrated approaches compromising social, healthcare, and housing solutions stand the best chances to ensure everyone in society has a roof over their head. And we need these integrated and long-term welfare solutions. So political will and a common goal to end homelessness is really the main element. And I very much agree. I don't remember who said it before, that what COVID has shown us is a incredible level of innovation and creativity. And that is because we have had one goal that we all work towards. So people stop talking about, who is supposed to do what, and they started talking about, what can I do? And that is a very important shift also in policy making. So I think Mr. Willem Adema showed a slide on emergency measures. So COVID was the reason, but basically nothing before COVID stopped local or national or EU in doing what has been done. For example, prohibiting evictions. If you cannot evict people due to economic reasons, I'm not talking about if you're a criminal, but if you cannot evict people due to economic reasons, for example, what solutions will then be developed? If you can't throw them out due to economic reasons, you have to help them. You have to help them stay. You have to help them be able to pay their rent. So we have to remember that if we maintain status quo, we are also killing innovation. And this is why I think this is such an important dialogue to have. So we have to make homelessness a part of a long-term integrated urban development agenda. And I think homelessness can really be the springboard for an ambitious effort to decrease social inequality and also to develop this social competitiveness that I really think we are on the verge of looking into. So I completely agree with what was said, that we need to be just as ambitious on the social inequality agenda as we are on the green transition agenda and the climate agenda, because we need to recover. And the climate is important, but I'm so sure that the consequences that we see socially from the COVID are not really clear yet, and we really need to prepare for that. And homelessness is a key element in doing that. So I think that's all from me now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for your input. I see that, Sarah, you have raised your hand to react. I don't know if other panelists want to react to the presentation from Martin or Natalia with comments or questions, but I'll first give the floor to Sarah.
Thank you. Well, it was a middle question, middle remark about social housing. And in Fondation Abbé Pierre, I want to say that we are really convinced that the change will be with the social housing providers, for sure. And because of the decrease, and you said that, Natalia, that because of the decrease of the state subsidies, we saw, for example, in France, that there is a difficulty for social housing providers to find balance between the necessity to provide some good housing, comfortable, new builds are really comfortable and green, and this is a goal also for the EU, and this balance between this and to keep a low rent for the poorest part of the population, and this balance can be found only if we have some state subsidies. If there is no public subsidies for the social housing providers, they will find the balance setting the dwellings to the private sector. They will find the balance with the impossibility to renovate the whole buildings. So I think that we have to find also the way to change the policy, state policy concerning the subsidies, public subsidies to social housing providers, but also the necessity to allocate the social housing to the poorest part of the population, because nowadays we see production of a lot of middle class social housing, and in France we did a survey in Fondation Abbé Pierre that shows that it's more and more difficult for poorest people to access even to social housing. So this is the question of the decreasing of help from the states to the providers, and the question begin at this state, and we have to keep the possibility for social housing providers to keep this balance to provide good housing also for poorest people. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think you echo the point made by Cara a bit earlier on what is affordability. And so I have a question to Natalia and to Martin. Natalia, you said in Denmark, it's a very open system for social housing. So how do you ensure access is possible to lowest income groups? Do you have a percentage? Because in France, we have a minimum percentage that each municipality has to devote to a lowest income group, and they don't always match it, but how does it work in Denmark? And then Martin, I know when we spoke to prepare this meeting, you said the problem is that some people who need to go into the program we provide are not eligible for it. So can you tell us a bit more about that, and how do you imagine the municipality of Lyon can cope with that, please? So Natalia and then Martin.
Yes. Yeah, so as I said, we have a universal model, but then at the same time we have so the municipalities have have disposal right over 25%, minimum 25% of all our housing stock for the most vulnerable. But in many municipalities, because there is such a close cooperation with the municipalities and the housing organization, it's higher. It's like 33 or 40. So all depending on the needs, because in the law, our purpose is to deliver housing to those in need. So a lot of municipalities have different criteria so that we kind of, so to say, fill it up from the bottom with the people who need it the most. So we have a universal model, but the way that it is made ensures that it is first and foremost for the people in need. Then we have certain types. That is kind of the common social housing. So family units, and then we also have youth units, and we have housing for the elderly. But we also have specific housing for people who are especially challenged. So we call them, crooked housing for crooked personalities. So housing where you can come and go, where you also have a stronger social cooperation with the municipalities. We have housing where you enter, for example, when you come out from prison, where you can live for 2 years, and then you are helped into moving into common housing, so to say. So we have many types of housing, but the overall issue, especially within the cities, which everyone know, is the amount. So we have the solution, we have the social housing model, it works, but we don't have enough housing. And I think this is our main issue right now, and this is what we're talking with the government about, that we need to build more affordable housing, and that's difficult within the cities because land is expensive. So I agree with looking at on the state aid rules. It's important because a lot of the solutions are already there on the ground.
Okay.
So this is where the no social harm clause is very important.
Thank you. So I will give the floor to Martin, then to Willem, and then to Eva to highlight one or two questions that have come up, and we will finish soon. Martin?
Clotilde, j'essaye en anglais, mais peut-être j'aurai besoin de toi.
Avec plaisir.
So first, we have an agreement with social housing for allocation for poor people, but like I said, we have only 6% for each year for people from the street or for roof sleepers. So it's not enough. So we have to increase the targets. But it's difficult because, as I say, we have a lot of requests ongoing, 70,000. So it's we have the market is very tendu, stressful. So it's difficult. Second point, of course, we can ask for more help for built social housing, but it's important, of course, but it's not the only problem. We have difficulties with all of the inhabitants, and it's difficult for social housing to find land to build. So it's the second point. And after, I think about the problem of the people without right to housing. When we launched the plan Zéro Retour à la Rue, we have 400 housing units, 400 flats for people from the street, but in fact only 40 households come from the accommodation because they don't have the right to housing. They don't have income, or they don't have the paper. So we have to try new type of solution, like temporary housing or something like that. It's a big problem because we have people who can stay in the street a very long time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, because they don't have right to housing, but they can stay in France. So I think we have something to do in this topic. It's very difficult. So.
Thank you, Martin. Perfect English and seriously, thank you. Willem.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank Martin and Natalia for their presentations, and I have a question for them. inspired by the lack of housing supply, and particularly in cities. Of course, with COVID, there has been a sharp increase. We haven't seen the numbers yet to illustrate how sharp this has been, but there's been a clear increase in teleworking, teletravail. You would expect that to lead, at some point at least, to reduce demand for office space. And that could increase space for living in cities. And I would like to ask you, as representative of local governments, municipalities, have you seen already any sign of a move in that direction of reduced demands for office space? Is there any indication that that might actually be happening? Thank you.
Thank you, Willem. Before I give the floor to Martin and Natalia, maybe Eva, can you jump in and highlight some of the questions that have been asked? So we take all the questions in one go.
So the first one is about the strategy in Denmark. So are there any measures for tackling homelessness among migrants through the national strategy, as many migrants can be found sleeping rough in Denmark? And second of all, what can be done at EU level to put pressure on member states to collect reliable and up-to-date data on people experiencing different situations of homelessness across Europe?
Thank you very much, Eva.
No problem.
So I can just say on the national strategy, it is anchored within the social ministry, so the Ministry of Social Affairs. So that is a part of it. At the moment, I don't know how big a part of it, and but we're in dialogue with them, and that is also a part of it. So we have like a more, you could say, it has different strings to it. So there is a part of this national strategy that we expect to be more social policy heavy, so to say, and then there is a housing policy string to it as well. Willem, yes, it is something that we have come across. We know that but actually mostly within the administration of the housing organization, so that they are, for example, not going through with plans if they need to move due to, for example, they hired a lot of workers, so they will not move, they will stay in the same building because there is an expectancy that you will not need as many fixed places there. I think in Denmark what has been, so just to answer shortly, yes, this is a part of the dialogue, but what has been a bigger part of the dialogue, but due to the same reason that you mentioned, is what effect does this have, for example, on children's education? So long-term effects, because if you're living in a small apartment and everyone has to work from home and everyone has to access internet and have a computer, and not everyone has this, you cannot go down in the clubs normally that you can because of COVID restrictions. So what does this actually mean to the educational level, and does it has social inequality goes right through there as well, and you see a big difference in kids that live in resourceful homes and kids that don't. So we see this also on the level of education and of course on care, basic care. So if you have a nice home, it's nice to stay home, but if you have parents who don't take care of you, it's really bad to be home. So this is a huge part of our focus point, and we are doing a lot of local activities to counteract loneliness, counteract self-isolation, because these are the consequences that will not change once society reopens. So business is going to, restaurants are going to open, people are going to go eat, but the consequences that especially children are going to have to live with, and people who might just be fragile or have really become lonely and self-isolated, they are not going to open up to the world. These are, social and psychic mental and big issues that we are going to have to deal with in our societies. And this is why I also think homelessness is so important, because if we manage to put this on the political agenda, it's like, you know, a door that opens to why then not also doing it here, why then not also doing it here. So yeah, sorry, a long answer, but very important issue.
Thank you, Natalia. Martin, on the question of the prices, have you seen prices go down, and is it an opportunity for city? Sorry.
Je vais te le dire en français, s'il te plaît, Clotilde.
Okay.
On n'a pas de réflexion, je crois, pour le moment sur les bureaux. Je ne pense pas que le télétravail va tellement changer. Par contre, ce qu'on pourrait avoir, c'est beaucoup de bureaux qui sont en cours de construction et qui pourraient, avec la crise, être convertis, en effet. Si c'est bien ça la question.
Okay, so at the moment there is not really any opportunity in terms of buying office space where prices that would go down, but where there might be opportunity is in offices that are currently being built. Maybe there the price will go down. And if I can add, actually yesterday at FIANSA we had an exchange with cities exactly. Well, it was on the question of transformation of hotels into long-term housing solution. And what came up from the debate is that actually because of the huge financialization of housing, the prices of hotels have not gone down so much, and even less for office spaces. So there are opportunities to rent hotels, but not to buy them so much at the moment. And some cities that have tried have found it hard to find affordable hotel to buy to transform into accommodation. I think we will have to stop now because we have already overrun the time. I'm very sorry. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I will just very briefly sum up some of the points from the discussion, and then maybe hand over to Kim for a final word. And on the question of, is it possible to pressure national member states so they can share their data on homelessness? Maybe you can say a word on that to conclude. So very interesting debate. Basically, I wrote your word, Natalia, that is COVID a wake-up call? Because we have seen a difficult solution of housing in the past. It has been exacerbated by the COVID. And as Cara said, the worst is yet to come because of employment impact and the impact it will have on households. But there are solutions highlighted, for instance, by Sarah. We have seen temporary emergency housing solution in Lyon, but also policy tools like eviction prohibition or prohibition of rent increase. So we see that there is a political will and a political opportunity to really address the question of housing long-term through social investments. But that the solution can't only be through public investment. We also have to find a way to mobilize dwelling in the private sector. And it came back from quite a few of the speakers that we need an integrated vision based on cross-sectoral cooperation. And again, I like your word, Natalia, when you said it's about keeping and maintaining a long-term focus. And that's what, Chloe, you presented from the Finnish vision, what worked in Finland, is that government after government, whatever the political situation was, they maintained this investment into housing first. So that's what we can hope now. And we can hope that the European level will give this direction. And Kim, is this just hope, or do we have the tool now for the EU to really encourage member states to go in this direction?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think this was a great webinar. Thank you so much all for your input. It is so good to see everything that is happening everywhere. And it's convincing me even more that we are at a very important point in politics to try to change the way we are handling this. And I really think that, you know, if we manage to get this integrated strategy and we actually agree to work together on a European level to try to tackle these issues, that we can move forward, that we will get there, and also that there will be enough capacity available, both financial and in general, also giving space for organizations and local authorities to do what they need to do. So I'm positive, and I really think that that we are going to change a lot in the coming months.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Kim, for hosting this event. Thank you to all the speakers, Willem, Cara, Natalia, Chloe, Sarah, Martin, and thank you to the participants and to EFA for the technical help. To you all, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.